All right, I'll give you all about 3 minutes for this one since it's a bit tougher. Like I said, not all questions should be the same amount of time. For this one, anyone have thoughts? I know it's super tricky. I'm guessing a lot of you diagrammed, I saw. Yeah?
So before today, I'd never heard diagramming for these questions.
Oh yeah? Okay.
Let's just go over what that.
Yeah, of course.
Assuming you mean like the quantities, like actually if F means, is that what you mean?
So basically diagramming typically on the LSAT involves anything with an arrow. So like X, arrow, Y. If I said if X then Y, that's how I would diagram it. That's all. So just basically making notations and symbols to better represent things more concisely, and then to get rid of all the fluff essentially. Because these have a lot of filler. So diagramming is a really useful technique to use primarily on logic games, but it can come in handy on logical reasoning. Sometimes, I think maybe on average, 3 to 5 questions in logical reasoning per section might be worth diagramming at most. I think people actually diagram far too often on logical reasoning compared to what's actually worth doing. Now this question here is a doozy, obviously. It's number 19, so it's going to be one of the more difficult ones in the section. I personally don't really like diagramming most statements. There are some techniques that have ways to deal with that, but I don't think it really does it justice. I would start off with this stimulus by focusing on the clear conditional indicators, like we have in line 3, however, any pet store, and then the final clause, no independently owned pet stores. That no is actually a conditional indicator. Like if we have the statement, no X's are Y's, we can diagram that and turn it into a conditional. Has anyone ever diagrammed this before or have an idea on how to do it? Yeah?
It would be X, arrow, Y flag.
Excellent. So X requires not Y. A lot of times people will diagram it incorrectly and say not X, then Y, but that's wrong. That's invalid reasoning. And here's why. If we said something like, no cakes are fruits, what does that mean? It means if something is a cake, then it's not a fruit. If you diagram to say not C requires F, that would be saying every single thing that is not a cake must be a fruit, which would really mean that everything in the world is either a cake or a fruit, which obviously is not true. So the no gets applied to the second variable in the sentence, and so you end up with a positive followed by a negative. So that's a positive arrow negative relationship, and we'll talk about this more when we get into logic games. But that's how you diagram it, that's how you symbolize it, and the reason this is important is so that you can link conditional statements together later. So with this particular question, we have the statement, no independently owned pet stores sell gerbils. So if something is an independently owned pet store, then it cannot sell gerbils. Now, the previous sentence uses the same variable, gerbils, as well. So we will likely be able to link these two statements together in some way. I'm focusing here only on lines 3 to 5 of the stimulus. I'm ignoring the first 2 for now. Third line, any pet store that sells tropical fish but not exotic birds does sell gerbils. So if it sells tropical fish and not exotic birds, notice that they said but, I'm doing and. That's because in logic, and and but are the same in meaning. They're just conjunctive statements joining together two variables in this case. So tropical fish and not exotic birds, then it sells gerbils. So this is like the fourth, and this is the third in the stimulus. Now, they both involve gerbils, but one is negative, one is positive. How might we deal with this? Exactly, the contrapositive. Now, two ways to go about it. We could translate this, or we could translate that. It might seem easier to translate this, and I'm going to show you how to translate both, just so that you have the options available to you if you need to. So the contrapositive is basically a logically equivalent statement that looks different from the original, but is identical in meaning. You get it by changing the order of the variables around the arrow and negating both. So G was at the end, now it's at the beginning, it was negative, now it's positive. IOPS was positive and at the beginning, now it will be negative at the end. So you could do this, and then you see TF plus not EB, arrow G, arrow not IOPS, it just continues chaining on going forward. So we could do that. And that would be enough. I want to show you both ways just so you have the flexibility if you ever need it. If we're dealing with the top one, IOPS requires not G. How do we deal with this? That's really the disaster, right? That's where it becomes troubling. So there's a way to deal with it. We just have to deal with this part in particular, which gets pretty nasty, but G becomes not G. I'll write it here first. Then these variables, like I said, for contrapositive, we reverse the order around the arrow and we negate. So TF becomes not TF, and not EB becomes positive EB. Now, I didn't put anything here. The other thing you have to consider with contrapositive is that the word and becomes or becomes and. So this and will become an or. So we have not G, arrow, not TF, or positive EB. So not G becomes arrow, not TF, or positive EB. Basically what this is saying is that if it's an independently owned pet store, then it does not sell gerbils, then it either lacks tropical fish or it has exotic birds. On this one, if something has tropical fish and does not have exotic birds, then it must sell gerbils, then it must not be an independently owned pet store. This is a lot of work, and I did double what you need just to walk you through the contrapositive. It's not so bad if you do just one of them on your own. And these are, of course, skills to practice in isolation as well. So get good at diagramming, get good at contrapositives, then you level up with this and or business that becomes a lot more complicated. So now that we have all this in front of us, anyone have any thoughts on how this might match up with an answer choice? This must be true, so all we have to do is basically make an inference based on the stimulus, based on our diagrams, based on our inferences. Keep in mind that for the contrapositive, we might want to jump over something like this. We may not need it. It may go directly from this to that, or from this to that, because they want to test our ability to have linked things together and to have taken contrapositives. And remember, like I said, no x's are y's. If x, then not y. Like I said, most pet stores, I don't want to even deal with diagramming most because it gets kind of messy, and we haven't really inferred anything about that specifically. We focused on these parts because they were simpler and cleaner to diagram. If we looked at B, no pet stores that sell tropical fish and exotic birds sell gerbils.
So I kind of discounted A right away because the stimulus doesn't let us know if it could be a must or a most question or not. It just gives us like an affirmative, either it does or it doesn't. It doesn't say most, so I just crossed out A right away.
Well, the first two lines do say most, though. So that's why I wouldn't dismiss it outright, but I would focus more on what's concrete. All right, so the right answer is what then? Okay, and how does that match up with this? Do you see a connection between them?
Well, I guess we can work backwards and use the last line and say that I understand the qualities that are necessary in order to sell gerbils, and then seeing that D matches up with the qualities that are needed to sell gerbils, so therefore an independent pet store doesn't have the qualities regarding birds and are necessary for gerbils, and therefore they also don't sell gerbils.
Well, so keep in mind that so these are necessary for selling gerbils, right?
Right.
Well, this is not gerbils, though.
Right. Yeah, this confused me.
Yeah, no.
That's the thing. I have to think about it, and this makes it more confusing for me. I don't know.
Well, if you're able to think about it and get it right off the bat, that's awesome.
Okay.
That's a good thing to be able to do, but I also want you to be able to articulate exactly why, because there might be a case in the future where you're not able to just do it in your head. I think this is too complex for most people to do in their head, I imagine, just because it's involving too many working parts. Like somebody asked about short-term working memory. I think.
And that was me.
Yeah. So this question involves more than most people could hold in their short-term working memory, which is why I think diagramming like this can be useful. Now, D is correct, and it's coming from this. The combination of lines 3 of the third and fourth clauses here. If it's independently owned pet store, then it lacks tropical fish or it has exotic birds. Now, what D is doing is saying that if it is independently owned, then it must lack this or must lack this. Meaning, if it's independently owned, then it cannot have TF and lack EB. This can never happen. If it's independently owned, this can never happen because this is essentially the negation of this necessary condition. Like this is the circumstance under which an independently owned pet store can never exist. And that's what D is saying, straightforwardly. Actually, I think it's actually nicer the way they wrote it in D than the way we have to say it on our own if we phrase it positively. Now, just to walk through what B looks like for those who are curious, no pet stores that sell TF and EB sell gerbils. So if you have TF and you have EB, then you cannot have gerbils. I could also walk through E a little bit, since that's also a clean diagrammable one. Any independently owned pet store that does not sell tropical fish sells exotic birds. I actually think it might be simplest to do this, not TF, then EB, and knowing that it's constrained to these pet stores in particular, then you could do the contrapositive if you wanted to, but of course we see that the argument is not really relating these two to each other, they're just talking about them in the context of the pet stores overall. Brutal question. I think overall the takeaway from it is that you want to focus on the parts you can link together. With inference questions with must-be-trues, if there's a variable mentioned in multiple parts, it's likely that you can link them together to make an inference, and that's what the LSAT is testing. They want to test your ability to link things together to make inferences, and the contrapositive, of course, is another kind of inference as well. So they're testing both of those here, contrapositives and linking.